There is a moment almost every deeply kind person eventually reaches, usually alone, usually late at night, when a single question surfaces and refuses to leave. Why does this keep happening to me? Not once, not twice, but in a pattern so consistent, it stops looking like bad luck and starts looking like something closer to a law of physics. The friend who only calls when they need something. The partner who mistook gentleness for permission. The colleague who took credit for the very project you stayed late helping them finish. You were kind. You were patient. You gave people the benefit of the doubt long after the doubt had been resolved. And somehow, that kindness didn't protect you. It seemed to invite exactly the people who would exploit it. If you've ever quietly wondered whether being a good person is actually a liability, whether the world simply punishes softness, you are about to understand something that has nothing to do with luck, and everything to do with a mechanism operating so far beneath conscious awareness that most people go their entire lives without ever naming it. We like to believe cruelty and kindness exist on opposite ends of some moral spectrum, strangers to each other, unlikely to cross paths. But look closely at the actual relationships that have hurt you most, and a stranger pattern emerges. The cruelty rarely walked in announcing itself. It walked in wearing exactly the disguise your kindness was least equipped to detect. And this is the first uncomfortable truth hiding at the center of this entire phenomenon. You were not targeted despite your kindness. In a disturbing number of cases, you were targeted because of it. Carl Jung offers a lens here that most self-help content never touches, because it requires implicating the very trait people are proudest of. Jung believed that every psychological strength carries a shadow, an unconscious cost that operates exactly opposite to the virtue on the surface. Applied to kindness, this means the same quality that makes you generous, forgiving, and easy to love can also, without your permission, make you nearly incapable of recognizing danger until it has already done considerable damage. Picture a specific kind of childhood, one where a child learns early that keeping the peace is safer than disturbing it. Maybe a parent's temper was unpredictable. Maybe love in that house felt conditional, available only when everyone behaved, stayed calm, avoided conflict. That child becomes remarkably skilled at reading a room, softening tension, absorbing discomfort before it can escalate into something worse. It's an extraordinary survival skill. It is also, quietly and without anyone intending it, the exact training ground for a lifetime of tolerating behavior that should have ended the relationship immediately. The kindness wasn't only generosity, it was a strategy learned under pressure for staying safe in an unsafe environment. And strategies, once installed, don't ask permission before running again in adulthood, long after the original danger has disappeared. But that isn't the real problem. The real problem is what this training does to your perception of red flags themselves. Because a nervous system built to keep the peace doesn't just tolerate conflict poorly. It actively misreads the warning signs that would tell anyone else to run. Watch closely the next time you excuse someone's behavior with a phrase like they're just going through a hard time, or I think they didn't mean it that way. These phrases feel like generosity. Often, they are actually a sophisticated form of threat minimization. A cognitive habit built to keep you calm in the presence of danger rather than alert to it. Psychologists studying interpersonal perception have found that highly agreeable people, those who score high on traits like empathy, cooperation, and conflict avoidance, are measurably slower to identify manipulation and dishonesty in others, not because they're less intelligent, but because their attention is oriented toward maintaining harmony rather than detecting threat. Cruelty, meanwhile, tends to be extremely good at reading exactly this orientation. Predatory behavior, whether conscious or not, is disproportionately drawn toward people who will absorb harm quietly rather than confront it loudly, because confrontation is expensive and quiet absorption is free. This is where psychology becomes genuinely uncomfortable, because it means the very warmth that makes you a wonderful friend, partner, or colleague also functions, in the wrong hands, as an advertisement. Evolutionary psychology offers a blunt way of understanding why. Every social species that relies on cooperation to survive also develops a subset of individuals who exploit that cooperation for personal gain, because cooperation only works if most members follow the rules, which creates an opening for anyone willing to break them. Researchers who study this dynamic call it a mixed strategy equilibrium, a population that contains both cooperators and exploiters in a stable, self-sustaining ratio. Because as long as cooperators exist in sufficient numbers, exploitation remains a viable, low-risk strategy for a certain kind of person. You are not imagining the pattern. You are witnessing a genuinely ancient dynamic, one that predates human civilization entirely, still quietly running itself out in office politics and group chats and family dinners. Think about the last time you sat in a group and noticed, almost instantly and without trying, which person would be easiest to talk into something they didn't want to do. You probably identified them within seconds, long before they said a word, just from posture, tone, the speed of their agreement. Now consider that manipulative people run the same calculation, constantly, often unconsciously, scanning any room for exactly this signal. Researchers who study interpersonal exploitation have found that people high in traits associated with manipulation are unusually accurate at identifying agreeable, conflict-averse individuals within moments of meeting them, sometimes from nothing more than a few seconds of unscripted conversation, or even a short video clip with no audio. This isn't folklore. It's a measurable, perceptual skill, the dark mirror image of the empathy that kind people use to read a room for comfort. Where you are scanning for who needs reassurance, they are scanning for who won't push back. The tragedy is that both scans often land on exactly the same person. Something even more dangerous is happening beneath the surface of all this, though, and it has to do with what happens inside you after the cruelty has already occurred, not before. Most people believe that once someone has clearly mistreated them, the relationship becomes easy to end. In reality, the opposite frequently happens, and Alfred Adler's psychology explains why with uncomfortable precision. Adler believed a significant portion of adult behavior is driven by an unconscious need to preserve a coherent self-image, and for a person whose entire identity has been organized around being the kind one, the good one, the forgiving one, walking away from someone who has hurt them can feel like a direct threat to that identity, rather than an act of self-protection. If I leave, does that mean I'm not as patient as I thought I was? If I stop giving them chances, does that mean my compassion has a limit? And what does it say about me if it does? This isn't weakness. It's a specific kind of identity entanglement, where your self-concept has become so tightly fused with the role of the forgiving one that ending a harmful relationship feels indistinguishable from ending a part of who you are. Think about the last time you caught yourself extending a 5th, 6th, 7th chance to someone whose behavior had already answered every question worth asking. Notice the exact thought that justified it. Maybe it sounded like I'm not the kind of person who gives up on people. That sentence feels noble. It is also, functionally, a trap. Because it means the more cruelty someone directs at you, the more chances your own self-image compels you to offer. Precisely because withholding those chances would contradict the identity you've spent a lifetime building. Cruel people, whether they consciously understand this mechanism or not, become remarkably efficient at locating exactly this kind of person. Because a person whose forgiveness is tied to their self-worth is, functionally, a person whose forgiveness never runs out. A cognitive bias known as the halo effect quietly deepens this trap. Once you've formed an early positive impression of someone, that impression colors how you interpret everything they do afterward. So a genuinely troubling comment gets reframed as just a bad joke, and a boundary violation gets reframed as they're just passionate. The halo effect isn't stupidity, It's an efficiency shortcut every human brain uses, an unconscious refusal to keep re-evaluating someone from scratch every time new evidence appears. Because full re-evaluation is expensive, and the brain prefers cheap, consistent narratives over costly, updated ones. For a kind person, this shortcut becomes a liability. Because the initial impression formed of most people, including manipulative ones who are often specifically skilled at first impressions, tends to be generous. Once that generous first frame is set, contradicting evidence has to work much harder to break through it than it would for someone who started out more guarded. The next realization changes everything, though, because it reveals that the relationship between kindness and vulnerability isn't actually direct. Something sits between them, quietly doing all the damage, and it isn't kindness itself. Kindness and boundarylessness are not the same trait, even though they are almost universally confused for one another, both by the kind person and by everyone around them. A boundary is not the opposite of kindness. It is what makes kindness sustainable rather than exploitable. The distinction matters enormously, because most kind people who have been repeatedly hurt draw the wrong conclusion from their pain. They conclude that kindness itself was the mistake, and they begin, slowly and often without noticing, to harden, to withhold warmth from people who never once tried to exploit it, to punish an entire future of relationships for the sins of a specific few. This is one of the quiet tragedies of chronic mistreatment. It doesn't just damage the relationship where it occurred. It teaches the wrong lesson entirely, aimed at the wrong target. And the person who once gave too freely often ends up giving far too little, to precisely the people who deserved better. Here is where Stoic philosophy offers a distinction sharp enough to cut through this confusion entirely. Marcus Aurelius, writing privately to himself while ruling an empire full of people who would have gladly exploited any weakness he showed, maintained that a person could remain fundamentally good, patient, and fair, while still refusing to be used by those who mistook his patience for an absence of limits. The Stoics drew a hard line between virtue and permissiveness. Being just in their framework sometimes required withdrawing kindness from someone actively abusing it, not as an act of cruelty, but as an act of justice, both toward yourself and toward the integrity of kindness itself. Seneca went further, arguing that indiscriminate generosity, extended without judgment about who deserves it, isn't actually virtue at all. It's closer to negligence, a failure to steward a genuinely valuable resource. Kindness, in this view, isn't meant to be infinite and untargeted. It's meant to be deliberate, protected, and given with the same seriousness you'd apply to any other resource, capable of being drained to nothing. Epictetus offered the sharpest version of this idea, insisting that a person's character belongs entirely to them, untouchable by anyone else's behavior. Which means the choice to finally withhold trust from someone who has repeatedly betrayed it is not a betrayal of your own goodness. It is, if anything, the clearest evidence that your goodness was never naive to begin with, only unpracticed at defending itself. Neuroscience adds a physical dimension to why repeated exploitation of your kindness leaves such a lasting mark, one that goes well beyond simple disappointment. Chronic exposure to interpersonal harm, especially from people you trusted, activates the same neural threat circuitry involved in physical danger, and repeated activation of that circuitry gradually lowers the threshold at which future relationships trigger it. This is why, after enough cruelty disguised as closeness, even a genuinely safe, kind new person can trigger a disproportionate wave of suspicion or dread. Your nervous system isn't malfunctioning. It's doing exactly what threat detection systems are built to do, generalizing from painful data to protect you from a repeat. The tragedy is that this protection, useful as it is against actual danger, often can't distinguish a manipulative predator from an ordinary, well-meaning person who simply reminds your body of someone else. Picture the specific moment a new person in your life does something entirely benign. cancels plans once, takes a day to reply to a message, and notice the disproportionate spike of anxiety that follows. A spike that has nothing to do with what actually happened, and everything to do with what happened the last time a pattern like this appeared. This is what researchers call stimulus generalization, a nervous system trained by one relationship applying its lessons indiscriminately to the next one. The way a person bitten by a specific dog can end up flinching at every dog afterward, regardless of temperament. The unfairness of this mechanism cuts in both directions. It protects you from repeating an old mistake, and it simultaneously risks punishing an entirely innocent person for a crime they didn't commit. Recognizing this pattern while it's happening, rather than being unconsciously ruled by it, is often the first real step toward telling the difference between a genuine warning sign and an old wound simply speaking up again. Viktor Frankl's psychology offers something essential here that pure self-protection strategies miss entirely. Frankl, who watched unimaginable cruelty firsthand and still concluded that meaning, not safety alone, was what allowed people to endure, believed that suffering becomes unbearable specifically when it feels meaningless, and becomes survivable, even transformative, the moment it's given purpose. Applied to repeated mistreatment by people who exploited your goodness, this offers a genuinely different way forward than simply becoming harder or more guarded. The pain of being hurt by cruelty doesn't have to mean your kindness was foolish. It can mean something else entirely. That you are now positioned, with hard-won clarity, to extend that same kindness with far greater precision, offering it fully to people who have earned trust through their actions, and withholding it deliberately from those who have only ever taken. This is where Jung's concept of integration becomes unexpectedly central to healing this specific wound. Jung believed real psychological maturity doesn't come from abandoning a trait that has caused you pain, but from consciously reclaiming authority over when and how that trait gets expressed. The goal was never to become less kind. It was to stop letting kindness operate on autopilot, offered indiscriminately to anyone who asks, and start directing it consciously, the way a person directs any other form of power they've finally learned to respect. A kind person who has done this work doesn't become cold. They become, paradoxically, far warmer to the people who deserve it, precisely because their warmth is no longer being siphoned off by people who never intended to reciprocate it. Imagine, for a moment, what it would actually feel like to give your kindness this kind of precision. Not less of it. Not a smaller, more cautious version of who you've always been. The same depth of warmth, but finally directed with discernment, offered generously to people who have shown, through consistent action rather than convincing words, that they can be trusted with it. Imagine noticing manipulation in its earliest, quietest form, not because you've become suspicious of everyone, but because you've finally learned to distinguish the specific texture of a person testing your limits from the specific texture of a person who simply needs a little grace. That distinction, subtle as it sounds, is the entire difference between a kind person who keeps getting hurt and a kind person whose goodness has finally become undeniable, because it can no longer be so easily taken. None of this happens instantly, and Jung would have been the first to say so. The old reflex, the instinct to excuse, to explain away, to offer one more chance, will surface again, probably in the exact moment you least expect it, dressed as compassion. That moment isn't a failure of your progress. It's simply the old pattern, still running its outdated code, gradually losing authority every time you notice it and choose, deliberately, not to obey it automatically. What changes first is never the instinct itself. It's the half-second of awareness that now exists between the instinct and the action, a gap that didn't used to be there. And that gap, small as it looks from the outside, is where an entirely different life quietly begins to take shape. That gap is also where something else becomes possible. Something most people who've been hurt repeatedly never expect to feel again. Discernment without cynicism. There's a common assumption that the only alternative to being taken advantage of is becoming guarded, watchful, slower to trust. But the people who do this work most successfully describe something different. A kind of clear-eyed generosity, warmth offered freely but never blindly. Attention paid not just to what someone says in a good moment, but to what they do across many ordinary ones. This isn't a smaller life, it's a more accurate one. And accuracy, it turns out, was the thing missing all along, not warmth. And this leaves you with the only question that actually matters. The one no boundary setting guide can fully answer for you. If your kindness was never the flaw, if it was simply undefended for most of your life, then what might it look like to keep every ounce of your warmth intact, while finally, deliberately, deciding who has actually earned the right to receive it? If this kind of psychology, the kind that reframes the very traits you thought were your weaknesses, is something you want more of, consider staying close. There's more of this coming, built for people who'd rather understand themselves fully than keep getting hurt by the same pattern twice.